Hello, and welcome to the Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast, a podcast that serves to educate and empower while we explore the intersections of social justice, economic empowerment, and holistic well-being within communities of color. I am your host, Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I invite you to join me as we dive deep into the crucial topics that shape our lives, challenge the status quo, and strive for a more equitable future for all. Hello. Welcome, Dr. Watkins, to the Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast. So happy to have you this morning. Still morning.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me, Dr. Morris.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Watkins. As we go back and forth with the doctor.
Right.
But I just want to briefly introduce you, and I know you'll spend a little time telling a little bit more about what you do. But Dr. Kimberly Watkins, please correct me if I'm wrong, is the professor at the University of Georgia, correct?
So I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Financial Planning, Housing, and Consumer Economics. Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I guess kind of a brief introduction. I like to introduce how I met folks. So Dr. Watkins and I go all the way back to probably freshman year. I don't know if we're friends, but we got to know each other because we stayed. For those who aren't aware, we both attended Florida A&M University, the Florida A&M University, go Rattlers, for undergrad. And so we met, I'm sure, freshman year. We were, for old school folks, we were both in Diamond. Were you in Diamond or McGuinn?
I was in Diamond, yes.
Hall. I was on the second floor, room 214, if I recall correctly.
I don't remember.
But nevertheless, so we certainly would see each other in the halls, but we became close and pretty fast friends once we both joined Student Government Association at Florida A&M. And since then, we've been friends through all types of life transitions, through weddings and twins and
being godmother of said twins.
Godmother. Dissertations. Dr. Watkins also served on my dissertation committee, which was an absolute honor and pleasure to have her specifically help me out on the quantitative portion of that. But yeah, so we've been friends forever, forever now.
And thank you for not cutting me off, because the very first time I think I talked to you, or maybe the second time, I accidentally called you Joycelyn, and you were very quick to correct me. I was like, oh, okay. Because I always I see your name and I still think about that sometimes.
What's so funny is I don't remember that because I correct so many people.
Right, you're still doing it, right?
Which is okay, and it gets sometimes it's a little awkward for me, but I know I have to do it because then people are gonna be like, "Why did you let me call you the wrong name forever?" But oh my God, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, it's okay. Just don't do it again.
Right.
But no, I get it all the time. I get Joycelyn all the time.
Yeah.
But that's too funny. So Dr. Watkins is here to chat a little bit about so much we can talk about. But on this episode, we're going to focus on financial shame. So before we get into that topic and get into your work, tell me, how did you get into this work? Because I have the luxury of having known you for such a long time. I know that this is not your first career.
Oh, no, not at all.
Right.
Well, first, go ahead. Before I get too deep, I just want the listeners, viewers to know these medals back here are not mine. I'm at my friend's house. But yeah, in terms like my road to where I landed, just not linear whatsoever. And I'm actually kind of happy about that, because then I get to use it as a testimony when I'm talking to my students and they're trying to figure out their life paths as well too. So I started out poli-sci, graduated, didn't think, all right, what does that really translate to in terms of like a job? I was just very gung-ho about pushing out real democracy and getting the people united because we'll never be defeated. And it's like, well, the people weren't hiring. So I went back to UF, I got a degree, a master's degree in business management, and unfortunately graduated at a time period at like basically the height of the recession, right? So did some jobs in between here and there, but my previous job, I worked as a human resources specialist for a federal agency. And my husband and I, we have been going through some issues in our marriage. And we realized some of those issues were connected to our finances. So we went through a financial education program. We united around that. I called ourselves the Debt Slayers 2013. That was our whole theme to everything. And then we went and taught the curriculum at our church. We did at another church and then taught at our church. And it was completely night and day in terms of how people were responding to it. And so my first group, we were pretty diverse, but it was mostly white. And then in the second group, it was a majority Black church. But on paper, if you were to look at the two groups, I don't really like to say pedigree, but people understand pedigree. The Black church, like well above, super educated, made way more money. Just every marker that you would look for to say, oh, yeah, those people are doing great financially, they had it. But they were not performing as well as the other church that we went through as attendees through the program. And so I was like, well, what's going on here? I'm confused. And so I've always wanted to go and get my PhD, but I just didn't really know what, but I always had an interest in personal finance. And financial planning wasn't a major when I was an undergrad. It wasn't something I even discovered until late 2007. And then it was like the worst time to get into financial planning. So we got out of debt and I hated my job. I love the people I work with, but I hated my job. And I was like, this is freedom. I can go pursue the thing that I actually want to do, which was to better understand people's behaviors as it related to money. And that question that I had when I was a facilitator was way bigger than I even knew, because even though we did our decolonization process at FAMU, it was still a lot more work that had to be done there. And that's when I got deeper into understanding like structural barriers and systemic racism, and then the cultural factors and how interventions that are created today don't incorporate the cultural aspects for us at all. And that ends up leading to what we'll be talking about today, is that financial shame piece. When I became a faculty member at University of Alabama, I was like, you know what? There's very little literature that is surrounded around Black people and money, just specific to Black people money. And everything was like, we're just at a deficit. I was like, we are a very resilient people, entrepreneurial. We get stuff done. So maybe it's the lens that's being used to examine us that's wrong versus there's something wrong with the group itself. Now, mind you, we do have our issues, but many of the issues that's creating those problems really from the system that we exist in. So I completely changed my research agenda and I just focus on marginalized populations with an emphasis in looking at Black people and our personal finance to get to a point where we're like, you can't keep putting these things out and not incorporate our culture. And then even within our culture, understand that there are subcultures within Black Americans as well, too. We're not a monolith. Yeah. So that's how I decided I wanted to do it, because that gap was there, because, that's what we're supposed to do as scholars, fill in the gap. Right. And it was huge. I remember when I did a lit review, it was in my first year of the program. I was looking for articles about Black women and investment behaviors and found 0 articles specific on Black women and investment behaviors or risk tolerance. I dang near had like a little mini crisis in the kitchen, because I couldn't even see myself reflected back into this field that I was trying to get into. Mm-hmm. So the only way that I'm going to see myself reflected is that I have to be the person who puts up the mirror first, connect with other people who are willing to hold up that mirror, and we're going to see ourselves reflected back. And we're going to make sure that our work is actually used to help people be in a better situation given their current circumstances, and not just some cookie cutter approach that really only applies to mostly white people. So that's how I got into that.
Okay. Well, no, like that is quite the pathway. And let me just say for the listeners, there's parts of that I didn't even know, to be clear.
I don't know what you didn't know.
And so, it's always good to learn new things about your friends.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that offline. But no, all jokes aside, before we fully delve into financial shame, one of the things I think that you said that might be helpful for some of our listeners, specifically those who are married. You mentioned that that catalyst was having some challenges in your marriage at that time, and realizing that those challenges were centered around how you both were taking into account your personal finances. And so you decided to take a course. But for the listeners, how were you able to, one, figure that out, and then ground yourself in a conversation? Was it you? Was it your husband? How did that come about, and how were you able as a couple to get on the same page and say, we both think that this is the challenge?
Yeah, around our 4th year of marriage, that was and has by far, we've been married, oh God, now math, like 14 years now. And year 4 was the worst year of our marriage. partly it was me. I had a lot of maturation to do. We got married very young. I was 23, he was 24. And we're very fortunate that we were able to come together and work on it because at those ages and getting married, like you don't really know yourself that well, right? And the willingness to accept them for who they are later on, like you still need some maturation to be like, oh, yeah, I did mean that. I'll do it. But seriously, we were fighting. And it wasn't even necessarily about money. We were just fighting all the time. And then I remember one day we were walking to Office Depot, Staples, one of those office supply stores. And I just randomly asked him, do you still not believe in divorce? Because when we got married, he told me he didn't believe in divorce. And I said, well, I do. So we'll come to that bridge when we get there. But the man who told me that he didn't believe in divorce, as we were walking into that store, said, I don't know. So it went from this hard, firm, I don't believe into something to, man, maybe I should consider this thing. And that struck me pretty hard. And I didn't want that. And I don't know, call it divine intervention or whatever it may have been. That conversation took place. And probably a couple days later, I remember getting to my apartment door and I just stood outside of it. And I was like, I no longer want conflict in my home anymore. I was already struggling with the work that I was doing because it wasn't what I was told I was going to do completely. And so your home is your refuge, right? It is your oasis, your place to go to be yourself and vulnerable and all that jazz. And I just stood at the door, key in hand. I was like, I don't want this to continue. So that night when he got in from work, we sat down and we talked about it. And we talked about, I had to admit, I love being Jack McCoy in a relationship. I went for that jugular, whether I was right or wrong. It felt like, apparently I just wanted to fight. But then I had to ask myself, well, why are you looking for conflict that way to feel good? Like what's really, there's a void inside there that will push you to the point that you're willing to put your significant other in a position where they feel less than so that you can feel better about yourself.
That's gonna
Yeah.
push somebody, right?
Right.
We're kind of about to get super sidetracked on it, but that level of self-reflection and self-awareness, I don't know exactly when the episode will come out, but I've had a conversation with a colleague of mine around mindfulness, and we
Mhm.
talked about it, like the idea of creating new neural pathways,
Mhm.
ideally creating ways to do things differently. And this is like literally a prime example where it seems like you were able to come to that conclusion on your own, and you said, hey, I don't want to be in conflict anymore,
Yeah.
so let me figure out a new way to do this, because this is not the outcome, the
Mhm.
result of this is not what I want anymore.
Right. And part of it also was like I grew up at home. My parents, like my dad didn't really fuss, but if he ever like cursed, and then we knew it was like, ooh, he must be really upset now.
Right.
Meanwhile, my mom on the other hand cussed us out every day. So it wasn't anything new. But when Dan and I got together, I was like, I don't want that in my relationship. That's not what I want to model to our potential children. But here I was doing that thing. And so it's common, right? It may feel like, dang, I'm doing that thing I said didn't want to do. But a lot of us fall into that space. And so we sat down that night. We talked about some of our issues as it related to each other, how we communicated with each other as well. And knowing that our personal finances were not as together as they should have been. Because one of the things that hurt us really was the lifestyle creep. It's like, oh, you went from a GS9 to a GS13. Okay.
By the way,
What's that like GS13?
governmental pay scales, correct? I'm just saying.
Oh, yes, this is a federal pay scale, the general schedule pay scale federal agencies use. And so, I mean, it's a substantial increase between the different levels. So I went from a 9 to 11 to 13 or 12 and 13. And then, people who know how to manage money would be like, okay, well, cool. I can still do what I need to do. And now I have like more to save or more to put towards a goal. And we were like, oh, we can get a better apartment now. Let's go down and get to off Eisenhower Avenue in Alexandria, be on Old Town and living it up. And, even though we talked about money, we knew how we were supposed to act with money, but for some reason it filled in some gaps for us as well. For me, I grew up without. And so a lot of people, when they grow up without it, all their needs were taken care of, but you wanted something fun and nice to do. That was not even a question to ask. Meanwhile, he didn't have that. He grew up in a household that looked like the Huxtables. So
Yes, he really
you're right. When people grow up without, they can do one or a multitude of things. Some of them become very conservative and they save because they don't want to go back into scarcity and have a scarcity mindset where they make sure they have all the resources. Or some of us get some cash and we're like, nobody can tell me no. I can do whatever it is that I want to do now, and I can get all the things that I couldn't do. And that was the way that I leaned towards it. He just likes to have nice stuff. So he knows he's a spender. So we did have to do some psych profiles of our own money behaviors. But when we got to that point that night, I mean, it was work for a couple of years. And we still do refreshers now over the communication book that we use. We'll occasionally just go through because it's maintenance at that point. So that really helped us. But there was also something about each of us that got to that point where we had to recognize that, all right, we want this thing to work. It ain't working. How do we make it work? Because a lot of people will go, oh, wait, this ain't working. Let me get out. And that's it versus trying to figure out what the next pathway can be to fix the issue. So that was the catalyst that pushed us into that financial education course and led to where I am today, to be honest. So
yeah, that's helpful. And one of the things that you mentioned is you acknowledge your background, right? You
Mhm.
acknowledge your experience. I think a lot of times when we think about finances, the first way to certainly make any kind of change in terms of what we're doing in anything, right? Whether it's
Mhm.
physical health, financial health, whatever it may be, is to recognize what are our patterns
Yeah.
and where were those patterns learned from, right? And so what I heard you say when mentioning that you grew up without, and I know the scarcity mindset, like that's my daddy.
Mhm. Mhm.
Very, no matter what, it's like,
Freshman
if I
era
can't,
baby.
can't
Yep.
spend that
Mhm.
money, or the other, like, yes, now I finally have, and I want to compensate for those things I didn't have. And I
Mhm.
think it requires a certain amount of awareness, right? To
Yeah.
recognize where
Mhm.
those patterns are going and to say all of our behaviors come from somewhere. That's number one,
Yeah.
right? And I think it's important to ground that. So as we talk about financial shame, what is that and where does it come from?
Yeah. So financial shame. I mean, it's just shame, but now we add finances to it, to be honest. But
Right.
seriously, it is an emotional and psychological response that a person has about their finances, whether it's perceived or real. So the perception for many of us is it could be, dang, it look like everybody else has their life together but me. Like I see people, they've got like nice cars, nice homes, good jobs and everything. Why can't I get this together? Like, what's wrong with me? And so there's that perception piece, or they're looking at their own finances and they're just like, this is not great. Meanwhile, they could easily have so much saved up and money. So, for example, we were talking about earlier, there's over 60% of Americans could not find $500 for an emergency if it were to pop up today when asked at that time period. And even as that number drops to like 250, that's still well over 50% of individuals who still don't know where they can turn to get that money, right? So somebody who's perceiving their financial situation to be horrible, but let's say they've got $2,000 in the bank. Over 60% of Americans don't know where they get $500, but you have $2,000.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't know if you're actually better off than others because with shame is internalized, right? It's about you versus just the behavior itself. So you're not going to talk about it with other people. You're just going to keep thinking that everybody else is doing better than you, but you don't even know that you're doing great in comparison to others. And so the actual part of it in terms of where that shame can derive from is it really could be the fact that, yes, sis, we need to get these finances together.
Right.
It might be too much debt, not enough savings. You're not doing the retirement savings or anything like that. So that is very real. And people may be aware of it and may feel like they can't do anything about it. So
Mhm.
then, whether it's perceived or is real, you still have the same response. The outcome is not just that you may have made a mistake or you haven't started doing something that's positive, but instead of seeing it as a mistake, you go, I am the mistake. And so you internalize that, and that then becomes your self talk. And then you start to engage in avoidant behaviors, which could look like not answering the phone when you see bill collectors calling about what's going on, not responding to emails, not opening up those statements when they come in. You're just removing yourself from that thing that makes you feel that shame. And so the response that you get from it, of course, is negative, and you're trying to avoid it. Think the second part of your question is, where does it stem from? The origins of financial shame? Was
Yeah,
that
like
what you
what?
had asked?
Yeah, like why do people experience this phenomenon? I mean, I'm assuming there are probably different reasons and potential
Mhm.
different backgrounds as to why financial shame comes about.
Yeah. So I think for Black people, particularly Black women, it's we're only like we only come from a place of creation, right? So you've had the responsibilities of the world literally placed on your shoulders as far as like our origin story.
Mm.
And then during periods of enslavement, because everything, even though people don't want to hear it outside of us, everything really does go back to slavery. And so during this time period, again, especially Black women, carrying the weight of the responsibility of being caretakers, not only to their own children, but also to their enslavers' children as well, too, or anything else that needs to be done in a caregiver role. And then also trying to make sure that their significant others, who especially were in a vulnerable state, having to watch these horrible things happen to their wives, keeping them uplifted as well. And so I truly think that's where that superwoman complex derives from. And it's just carried on over Jim Crow all the way up until today, right? Like we're still have this narrative in our heads that we have to be all things to everyone, because if we don't, then who's going to do it? And we really do go through this in terms, not just even our personal finance lives, in terms of taking care of loved ones and friends,
Mhm.
but shoot, we always saving the country when it's election time too. Like, right? It's like, congratulations, Senator Warnock and Joe Biden. Thank a Black woman today, you know? But a lot of that really stems from that caregiver role and always having to be better than, how we always have to be better than white people. You can
Yeah.
never be caught slipping. And if you are in this area, you're not necessarily doing the things that you think you're supposed to do, or you know there are things that you're supposed to do, well, then people are going to see that and they're going to think less of you. And you can't let people think less of you, because you always have to be great and on it. So then that comes to a point where, because shame, you've internalized it, now you're avoiding it, and you don't want other people to know about this thing. So now we don't talk about it. The other part is the financial socialization piece. Financial socialization is how we get our beliefs, attitudes, values about money, and how that translates into our behaviors and our financial well-being. And that's really the most important part of it. So if you've grown up in a household where people didn't talk about money, you weren't taught how to manage your bills, you weren't taught anything as it relates to investing, all those different concepts, then how are you to know how to do these things?
Yeah.
And then where shame comes in with that is, again, there is this perception that everybody else knows how to manage their money and everybody else knows how to do these things that you don't know how to do. But because we're not talking to each other, you wouldn't know that they too don't know what to do.
Are
Maybe
struggling.
you
Yeah.
would also find out, like, keeping up with the Joneses. I'm like, the Joneses are in bankruptcy, but you don't know that, right? Because exactly, because we're always supposed to put on that facade, that face. You're strong, keep it together, you're better than you know. Like, we need to start talking to each other. And we'll find that most people are going through the exact same thing as ourselves. But with shame, it's really hard to overcome that, because you've made it about yourself versus the actions that may have led to you feeling that shame. And a lot of that's just consequences of not even your own doing, but you take it on as if, yeah, I should have known better. You
And
can
do you
only
think
do better when you know better, right?
yeah,
So,
one thing I wanted to ask you is how are people of color positioned in the research? First of all, is there research on financial shame?
yeah,
I know we talked a little earlier about general financial literacy and
yeah,
knowledge. There's often this presentation of deficit in the few studies and research that are done on people of color, specifically Black people, which
Yeah.
there's not a lot. Hence, you know that, and I know that. And
I will say on the research side is extremely limited.
Mm.
I have seen a couple articles that's specific to Black people and financial shame, but the vast majority of it, they don't care. Like, anyone can be in their sample instead of it being specific to us. Where there's more information really is from the individuals who are doing the work. So there is a site called Of Color, and I got to meet Tanya Brown. She's one of the directors for the site, and they specifically focus on people of color unapologetically, as her website has it written, because they know all of the barriers, all the historical context that affects our ability to build wealth and increase our financial acumen. And so they have a really cool blog series that they do. They have more content there than if you were to go to Google Scholar and try and find something.
Right.
And actually, I prefer that because they're practitioners. So they're really working with people, whereas researchers, they collect their data, use secondary data, and then run it and like, ta-da! And then the practitioners go, yeah, we've been doing that. so it's far more applicable, that I would say, than just empirical work alone. Chloe McKenzie, she has a wonderful site where she focused specifically on Black people. You've had Michael Thomas on your show. Michael has built his counseling firm that is specific to Black men. That is his targeted audience who he wants to work with. He has written his book, Black Financial Culture. People are out there, and I'd be happy to pull a more extensive list. These are just folks I'm thinking off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But it's more so going to come from folks who are either in the profession and working versus like academia, because academia is running a whole 25 years behind everything else that's going on, which is unfortunate. But at the same time, it presents an opportunity for me and my colleagues to fill in those gaps. And what's different about us, I feel, is that we wanted to be able to actually have a real impact on people's lives by informing the folks who work with them, whether it's the counselors or the planners or it's lawmakers. Like, these are real issues. We tested it. Everything that they've been saying for decades is real. And now you need to start doing these things.
If you think about America as a country, we are taught this kind of bootstrap mentality.
Yeah.
Right? Pull yourself up by bootstraps, and I made it, and all the other different immigrant communities who come here and made it, but weren't necessarily enslaved in coming here, right? And still aren't being targeted as it relates to the majority of the policies and practices that are being put in place. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I'm glad you brought up the point of financial socialization. And just by way of the listeners knowing, my research was around Black college students and their financial practices, behaviors, their socialization as well, which is how they learn about it. And brief way of introduction, part of the reason I got into the work was we were always having by we, I mean, my daddy was always having conversations about money, about savings, about investing, all of the above. And I assumed that this was happening in every household. And it wasn't until I got to college, I think, that conversations were different. Like, I don't know if you remember if we hung out that much, but I used to always be like, I don't have it at certain points in time in college. And for me, if I didn't have money, that meant I had spent what I had allocated to spend. And I wasn't dipping into my savings. And I think a lot of people thought like, oh, it was just like, no. This is
right.
On the line.
I don't have any money, but I'm going to go see Beyonce. Like, wait, well, where did you get that money from?
I'm dipping into savings, so therefore I didn't have it. And I always operated that way. From the very beginning, I was taught to pay my credit card bills off in full, always have and while that message was taught throughout the entire household, I think there's certainly varying levels of adaptation amongst of those practices, but I did. And so part of the reason I wanted to get into this work was to have those conversations. And I find that going to the financial shame, you're right, people don't talk about it. I was doing work while I was finishing up my doctorate as a student assistant in the startup FIU program and working with local entrepreneurs who were majority of color and often immigrants, especially being in Miami. And there was one particular couple, and I think they felt a lot of that, a lot of shame. They didn't want to talk about their finances. They don't want to show you where things really are. And my thing was always, you can't change what you're unwilling to address. Right. And the first part is being willing to address it and not being shameful for it. Like, I had a particular couple who went ghost, but I didn't want to Like they
Yep.
talk to me about their financials. And so how do we part of the reason I started this podcast, like how do we have the conversations? How do we talk more about money? How do we not just remove the shame too, but I feel like there's a part where
There is.
people don't talk about what they make, right? Like people won't tell you how much money they make. And unfortunately, some of it is, I'm sure there are certain individuals where they're like, if I tell them, the next thing I know, they're going to be asking me for money. They're going to be hitting me up
Mhm.
for this and that. But you don't know what you don't know. And so
Right.
how do you know what to petition for? How do you know what to ask for? And I strongly believe maybe not necessarily in all ethnic groups, but in certain classes of certain ethnic groups, these conversations are happening because being
Mhm.
poor is being poor. And I think financial shame is consistent across those who would be considered quote unquote poor and
Yeah.
even maybe middle class. I don't think it's colors, or race specific.
Mhm. Yeah.
But I do think that in certain class circles of, say, white individuals, they talk about what they're investing, right?
Yeah.
And they talk about what stock they just bought. They talk about their salary or what bonus they just got. They help each other level set in conversations. And so how do we change that? Right? Like how
Right.
do we address that? Well, that's all we have for this week's episode. Want to learn about how we can address that very issue? Be sure to join us next week for part 2 of this conversation with Dr. Kimberly Watkins. Enjoyed the show? Be sure to like and rate the podcast. You can find the Race, Wealth, and Health podcast on multiple platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. I also want to hear from you, so don't forget to connect with me on social media. You can follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook at Race Wealth Health. By joining the online community, you'll stay updated on the latest episodes, behind the scenes insights, and engaging discussions. Share your thoughts, comments, and questions there. I appreciate your support in sharing the podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues who may also find value in these conversations. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, stay informed, and keep up the good fight for equality.